What if I told you that the concept of national debt is a carefully constructed illusion? You're taught to think of it like your own personal debt, a number that needs to be paid down, a burden on future generations. But the reality is far more complex, and far more unsettling. The real question isn't how much debt is there, but rather, who owns it? Because when you follow the money, you don't just find governments and taxpayers. You find a hidden architecture of power, a system where debt is not a liability, but the ultimate tool of control. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is the censored truth about the puppet masters of global debt. To understand who truly pulls the strings today, we must travel back to a moment of chaos, when an old empire was dying and a new one was about to be born on the foundations of debt. We must go back to the dawn of the 20th century. The year is 1913. The world is a patchwork of empires, but the financial center of the universe is London. For centuries, the Bank of England, a private institution, had perfected the art of financing the British Empire's ambitions through debt. They understood a fundamental secret: a nation that controls its own debt, and can issue its own currency, never truly goes bankrupt. It can always create more money to pay its creditors. But across the Atlantic, the United States was a financial Wild West. It had no central bank. The nation's money supply was at the mercy of private bankers like J.P. Morgan, who single-handedly had to bail out the country during the Panic of 1907. This event terrified the political establishment. They realized that the nation's fate was in the hands of a few immensely powerful men. Their solution? The Federal Reserve Act of 1913. It was sold to the public as a way to stabilize the financial system and wrestle control away from Wall Street. But here is the first twist in our story: the Federal Reserve wasn't a fully government entity. It was a quasi-private corporation, a network of 12 regional reserve banks owned by the private member banks in their district. For the first time, a private consortium of bankers was given a legal monopoly over the creation of American currency. And how was new money created? Primarily by buying government debt. The government would issue bonds, and the Fed would create money out of thin air to buy them, charging interest for the privilege. Think about that for a moment. The U.S. government now had to borrow its own currency into existence from a private cartel of banks, and pay them interest on it. A perpetual debt machine had just been switched on. This was the blueprint. This new system got its first major test with World War I. Wars are astronomically expensive, and they are always financed by debt. The U.S., with its new central bank, was able to create unprecedented amounts of money to fund the war effort for itself and its allies. By the end of the war, the old powers of Europe were crippled by debt, and their primary creditor was the United States. The financial center of the world quietly shifted from London to New York. But the true masterstroke came at the end of another, even more devastating war. At the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, the U.S. made the world an offer it couldn't refuse. Every other currency would be pegged to the U.S. dollar, and the dollar, in turn, would be redeemable for gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. The world agreed. Why? Because the U.S. held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves and was the only major economy left standing. In an instant, the U.S. dollar became the world's reserve currency. The Federal Reserve effectively became the world's central bank. Who benefited? The United States, of course. But more specifically, those who sat at the heart of this new system. International institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank were created, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Their mission was to provide loans to developing nations, loans denominated in U.S. dollars. If a country needed to buy oil, it needed dollars. If it needed to trade internationally, it needed dollars. And if it needed dollars, it had to play by the rules of the system created and controlled by the U.S. The puppet masters now had a global stage. This gold-backed system had a fatal flaw. The U.S. government, funding both the Vietnam War and massive social programs, was printing far more dollars than it had gold to back them up. Other countries, particularly France, saw the writing on the wall and began demanding gold for their dollars, draining U.S. reserves. The system was about to collapse. So, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon did the unthinkable. He unilaterally severed the link between the dollar and gold. The Nixon shock sent the global financial system into chaos. The dollar was now a fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith in the U.S. government. Why didn't the world abandon the dollar then and there? This is the critical, often overlooked, part of the story. The U.S. government, led by Henry Kissinger, struck a secret deal with Saudi Arabia in 1974. The terms were simple: the U.S. would provide military protection and weapons to the House of Saud. In return, Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars and invest its surplus oil profits back into U.S. government debt. Other OPEC countries followed. Suddenly, the dollar wasn't backed by gold anymore. It was backed by oil. Every country that needed oil, which was every country, now had an insatiable, permanent demand for U.S. dollars. The debt machine went into overdrive. The consequences were immediate. The U.S. could now run massive trade deficits without consequence. It could buy real goods from the world, cars from Japan, electronics from China, by simply printing pieces of paper. Nations around the world had no choice but to accumulate these dollars, which they then used to buy the safest asset they could find, U.S. Treasury bonds. Essentially, countries like China and Japan were lending America the money to buy their own products. When developing nations in Latin America or Asia fell into crisis, the IMF and World Bank would arrive with a solution: bailout loans. But these loans came with strings attached, a program called structural adjustment. This forced countries to privatize state assets, cut social spending, and open their markets to foreign corporations, often benefiting the very financial institutions that held the original debt. It wasn't a rescue, it was a hostile takeover, financed by debt. The system seemed unbreakable. But the cracks are now impossible to ignore. Fast forward to today. Global debt has exploded to over $300 trillion, a number so vast it's almost meaningless. The United States government itself is over $34 trillion in debt. But who owns it? You might think it's China or Japan. While they are major holders, they only own a fraction. The shocking truth is that the largest single holder of U.S. debt is the U.S. government itself and the American public, primarily through the Federal Reserve and Social Security trust funds. The Fed's balance sheet has ballooned from less than $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $8 trillion today. It has become the buyer of last resort for government debt, a process called monetizing the debt. It's the equivalent of writing a check from your left pocket to your right pocket, and calling yourself richer. But the real power has shifted again, this time to a new set of puppet masters, colossal asset management firms. Companies like BlackRock and Vanguard manage trillions of dollars in assets. They don't just own government debt, they own massive stakes in nearly every major corporation in the world. They are the biggest shareholders in Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and even the banks that are supposed to be their competitors. Their influence is quiet but absolute. They operate at a level above governments, shaping policy not through votes, but through capital allocation. This is a new form of empire, one that is not defined by borders, but by balance sheets. So, what can we learn from this century-long story of debt and control? First, the key takeaway: global debt is not a bug in the system, it is the system. It was designed to centralize power, first within a nation, and then across the entire globe. Second, the world's reserve currency gives its issuer an exorbitant privilege. For 80 years, that has been the United States, allowing it to export its inflation and consume beyond its means. But this privilege is not permanent. And third, true power is not political, it is financial. The entities that create and control a nation's money supply ultimately control its destiny, regardless of who sits in the president's office. We are now in the late stages of a 50-year experiment with pure fiat currency, a global system backed by nothing but faith and oil. As nations like China and Russia begin to settle trades outside of the dollar system, and as digital currencies challenge the very notion of state-controlled money, that faith is being tested like never before. The question for you is, what happens when the music stops? Who will be left holding the debt, and who will be revealed as the true puppet masters? This is a story that is still being written, and understanding its past is the only way to prepare for its future. If you want to continue peeling back the layers of our financial history, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you believe truly controls the levers of global finance today? Thanks for watching.